I'm Paul Merchant, and I have been the interviewer for the Changing Planet strand of An Oral History of British Science, which is concerned with the physical earth sciences and to some extent the environmental sciences, so it's disciplines like geology, geophysics, geography, oceanography. When scientists are usually interviewed, the focus is often on their career and on their scientific work only. So that's what they're used to talking about, and to some extent that's what they expected they'd be talking about when they said yes to us. But the life story or history approach asks them to talk about their whole life, in other words, things done outside of work and things done well before they became a career scientist. And this allows us to see that scientists are more ordinary than we thought they were, which doesn't sound very promising, but what I mean is that it allows us to see that science is a kind of work like any other, and it fits into a life which is like any other, and it has a day-to-day structure, and it has elements of the humdrum and the ordinary and the just doing. And so through the life story approach, scientists seem more familiar, I think, to us than they would otherwise be, and in that way more interesting. I've become very interested over the project in the way in which scientists talk about their childhood. They talk about their childhood at the start of the interview, but often throughout as well, nipping back to it to explain things. And it seems to me that childhood is often used as a way of making themselves understandable to others and perhaps making themselves seem and feel coherent, if you like. So when they look back at their childhood and they remember it, and they're often helped in remembering it by things like conversations with their parents, photograph albums, diaries and so on, when they look back at their childhood, they tend to pick out particular events that they see as significant or see as being formative, missing out all of the other details and complicated mixtures of things that happened in childhood and just picking out these few things: a walk on a beach with their father looking at pebbles, or a visit to an aircraft factory, or a particular book found in a library. And so, yes, I think that events are being taken from childhood and given retrospective importance. We're often asked to worry about how reliable oral historical accounts are. But I think that's rather missing the point that you get two kinds of information in a life story, oral history at least. One is scientists are referring to things more or less accurately, things that actually happened. I think we have to assume that. And so it allows you to recover scientific practices of the past and things about people's lives in the past that actually happened. Okay. The other kind of information that you get from oral history interviews is the way in which people tell their life stories. And so if somebody is selecting from the past particular things, if someone is tending to tell the story in a particular way, that is in itself a kind of information. That is itself interesting and is part of the record. And I think, to be honest, I've become more and more interested in that, really, the way in which people tell their life stories, as much as the actual content of the scientific work, which is itself very interesting. If you were to listen to the life story interviews with climate scientists, I think that you would be surprised that climate science is as ordinary as it is. By that I mean it involves going to a workplace, setting up a machine, repeatedly making measurements of something, recording, making sure that the printer's got enough paper, correcting problems with the computer, assembling a lot of information together, putting it on a screen, clicking through it, thinking about it, writing text, trying to make that writing a bit clearer, making an argument. It involves a kind of day-to-day work that I think we might recognise. It doesn't involve so much of the sort of thinking, a scientist sort of out in the wild dreaming up thoughts, or having a sudden spark of inspiration, or looking at one particular piece of ice and there in front of them is this magic truth. In fact, climate science comes from a kind of day-to-day work. There's one very famous climate scientist who's been in the media quite a lot and cast as a kind of, in some cases, as a kind of malevolent genius, sort of trying to mislead. But if you look at the detail of what he actually did, a lot of it was work in libraries, getting data off shelves, looking through books, being annoyed that he couldn't find 1857 because someone had stuck it back into the volume for 1912 or something. And it's work, it's photocopying, it's comparing, it's looking and reading. Life story oral history is very good for getting people to talk about how they felt in certain situations and about how they understood themselves as being similar to or different from others. What we have with the earth sciences in the second half of the 20th century is a particular culture that tends to be white and male, often privately educated, and this produces a kind of general masculine culture. We interviewed a number of women who found themselves within this culture, and we're able to talk to them about how they felt alongside this culture, how they felt to be mixing with this group, how they understood themselves as different to or similar to those around them. And in this way you get a sense of the feelings of outsiderness that go along with being different in science, and the kind of personal strategies that they had for coping with that, which tended to be to try to sort of get on with it, to keep their head down, to blend in, to not be different, to have fairly modest claims about what they were doing, but to sort of diligently get on with the work. I think it's very important, if you want to understand what science is, and perhaps what British science is specifically, that you don't make any assumptions beforehand about what it is. I mean, if we think we already know what science is, then there's no point in studying it. And if you're going to make no assumptions about what science is, that means that you can't have in mind certain questions that are relevant to ask someone who's a scientist and certain questions that aren't. And therefore you have to ask about everything. You have to collect all of the information and then think afterwards about what is significant and what isn't. It would be a great mistake, I think, to sort of theory build in advance. If you're really serious about approaching science with no preconceived ideas about what it is, you've got to ask about everything. Otherwise you're deciding that asking about reading encyclopedias as a child is important, but asking them about drumming isn't. I think if you want to really know what science is in its full ordinariness, then you really ought to listen to Oral History of British Science interviews.